So in the study on alternative food movements in Fairbanks, we were particularly interested in community-supported agriculture and the six farms involved in community-supported agriculture. There was a farmer's market, the cooperative market, school gardens, as well as a community garden that had been in place in Fairbanks since 1979. But again, for our focus, we were most interested in the community-supported agriculture. So we met with Calypso Farm and Ecology Center as well as Rosie Creek Farm in order to think about doing this research. And we did our distribution over the summer and late summer of 2009 with a response rate that was fairly good for a written survey. 37.4%. Most of those surveys were completed, which is fairly remarkable considering that they were about 6 pages long, comprising about 100 questions, and probably took the average respondent anywhere between 40 minutes and an hour to complete. So there was a high degree of investment in the survey. There was no monetary compensation for participation in the survey as a whole. We came up with the questions from a study that had been done in 2002 in central Pennsylvania by Paul Durenberger, at the time with Penn State. And he used his data with his data analysis. He ended up using Anthropology, which is a program made by Steve Borgatti, which is available for free online right now. With our survey instrument in 2009, we borrowed many of his questions, altering a few of those after meeting with local residents, and probably could have altered a few more. We did analysis with Anthropac as well as R for statistical research, statistical computing, and we looked at demographics of who participated in CSA, how they participated, and their overall satisfaction with community-supported agriculture in central Alaska. And you can see here that our education level was fairly close to what Paul Durenberger reported on the bottom there. You can see that he was looking at some college and undergraduate, and we were interested in parsing that out a little bit more in terms of educational level. And you can see that the majority of participants in community-supported agriculture had a bachelor's degree or higher. We compared that with the Fairbanks North Star Borough, which was right around 28%. And participants reported that they themselves had anywhere upwards of 88% graduation from undergraduate institutions. So a real upswing here, 28% up to 88%, 60% difference in the population as a whole versus who is participating in community-supported agriculture. Further, we see that household income played somewhat of a role in agriculture, in participation in community-supported agriculture, with a majority of individuals in higher income brackets overall, making 75,000 plus. It looks like here we've got upwards of about 50% of our group making, of those who return the surveys, making along the lines of $75,000 plus. So certainly middle to upper middle class in terms of income overall. And we see some of the same mirroring in Paul Durenberger's work, with just a slight, well, definitely an increase there of the 50 to 74,000 range in relation to some of the others. In terms of ethnicity, we can see that in Fairbanks as a whole, and this is, we used information from Fairbanks from the census. In the Fairbanks North Star Borough, the ethnicity is primarily white, but we see a disproportionate number of individuals self-identifying as white and participating in community-supported agriculture as a whole, with about 80% white in Fairbanks and upwards of 95+% white who are participating in community-supported agriculture in Fairbanks. We also see differences along the lines of gender. with women being responsible primarily for food production as individuals, and then also primarily responsible for membership in community-supported agriculture endeavors. So we're interested in, so those are some of the demographics behind CSAs, and we can see that along the lines of things like education, self-identified ethnicity/race, income levels, and gender, all of these factors go into who is actually participating in community-supported agriculture and CSAs. And a lot of this mirrors earlier work that's been done on community-supported agriculture and indeed continuing work on CSAs, noting differential participation rates overall. We were also interested in whether community-supported agriculture participation had any sort of difference for individuals overall. And we found that people generally agreed with the statement that CSAs changed eating habits. That people would eat more produce as a whole, as well as eat a greater variety of produce as a whole. And some of the our questions were primarily conducive to entering in an Excel format. We also had qualitative questions that allowed people to write responses. And so we asked, how exactly has being in a CSA changed your eating habits? And here you can see some of the responses here by gender and age of participation as a whole, the idea of eating more real or unprocessed foods, the idea of spending time in order to cook and coming across new vegetables, this idea that eating is an adventure. But in Fairbanks, of course, it's a relatively short-lived adventure with a short growing season of 20 weeks. And then, of course, it becomes more boring, as one female in her 20s describes. For our report, CSA members, we looked at some other aspects of environmentalism and behavior as a whole. Not surprisingly, in Fairbanks, we saw that not very many self-identified as vegetarian, but many of the participants engaged in things like gardening, in things like recycling. And I will point out that in many areas of Fairbanks, curbside recycling was not really available. It was rather interesting the extent to which some people had to go to actually do that recycling. Supporting environmental organizations right there around the middle, and then buying organic elsewhere. So you can see composting, buying organic, and gardening, things that are specifically in line with the idea of agriculture as a whole, tend to score a little bit higher than some of the other ones. But composting too, individuals weren't really that into doing compost. They were not really likely to do that. Now, the other question is, in the notion of CSAs, we have the notion of community. And a lot of the discussions about community-supported agriculture, do they really promote this notion of community? We can say that we have more adults that are eating from a share than live in a particular household, and this could indicate that individuals are sharing the food with one another. We could also argue that on farms that particularly promote the on-farm work programs like Calypso Farm and Ecology Center, that this creates the space for being in a particular environment, this notion of tactile space. This is from Carolyn, this notion of coming into the environment and coming to know the environment in a particular way. So the answer is a qualified yes from our rather minimal questions on our survey that go to the notion of community as a whole. But of course, this would vary from farm to farm. CSA members, we asked them to rank the reasons that they had for joining a CSA, as well as their preference for a retailer outside of CSAs as a whole. Number one reason that was given was getting better food. So this idea of individual self-improvement in terms of quality of diet and nutrition. Next was helping to support a farmer, which ranked relatively lower, helping the environment right there at the middle, and then much less likely was the idea of getting cheaper food. People generally disagreed with that statement of getting cheaper food, although over time, CSAs are relatively cost effective when you consider the cost of produce in Fairbanks, Alaska. In terms of preference for a retailer outside of CSAs, people chose farmers markets, then the supermarket very close, the co-op, the natural food store. There are very little natural food stores in Fairbanks. The mom and pop grocer, same sort of thing, and then the convenience store. And I should point out that at the time the survey was given, the co-op was very much in an early stage overall. Now, there have been a number of critiques of alternative food movements. Some point to the notion of social justice, these are really enclosed types of spaces that individuals don't really, if they're focused on what they're getting themselves, they don't think about the larger sort of structural issues within food systems, such as migrant labor that we talked about earlier. The idea of color blindness, Julie Guthman's work in California and alternative food institutions, where you often see white Anglo college-age students who are selling the produce in farmers markets, and you have primarily Latino male middle-aged farm workers who are responsible for growing a lot of the produce in California. Guthman also has this idea of the notion of if people only knew how good food was for them, they would come out and they would experience these organic foods. Collier says it represents an irrational romanticism, and Spector notes that it's an organic fetish overall. As a whole, we can note that there are potential benefits of community-supported agriculture. However, they do not accrue to the community as a whole, but rather to specific members of a community. They provide those members with relatively high educational attainment as well as income, the notion of true choice that supermarkets do not necessarily offer. Potential for social justice at a smaller scale, potentially building community. We see this with various iterations of community-supported and community-shared agriculture, where, in particular, community-shared agriculture, where that becomes a primary motivation for the setup of the system, rather than ensuring that the farmer is meeting a base economic needs of maintaining the farm as well as their livelihood. The potential for transformative capacity in this particular setting, and the idea of tactile spaces, and then Cox's work on graduating effects, this notion of coming into the environment, coming to know the environment, interacting with others, and coming to know the environment overall. So we've gone through quite a bit in this lecture and talked about a number of different things in terms of food systems and some of the big questions that emerge in terms of food security. Should food be a universal human right? Should this be something that's available to everyone overall? We can see that we have food systems which are so-called alternative food systems, which provide some measure of higher quality local organic foods that are acknowledged by individuals to be healthier for them. But we also must note that some of these health foods that come to us through marketing channels that do not necessarily protect social justice or equality overall. So overall, I hope to have provided you a good overview of the issue of food security with a number of different ethnographic examples from North America.